The phone rang at 6:37 in the morning. Not the gentle buzz of an alarm or the familiar ringtone I'd grown accustomed to over 15 years of marriage. This was the sharp, insistent sound of my bank's fraud alert system cutting through the early morning silence like a blade through silk. I was already awake. Had been for hours, actually, sitting in the kitchen chair that faced our bedroom door, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the sun paint shadows across the hardwood floor, waiting for exactly this call. My husband David lay sleeping 20 feet away, one arm draped across the pillow where my head should have been. Where it had been every night for the past decade and a half, until 3 months ago when I started noticing the small things that would eventually unravel everything I thought I knew about the man I'd married. The things that told me he was planning to destroy me. The automated voice was crisp, professional, almost apologetic as it delivered the news I'd been expecting. Unauthorized access to my personal savings account. Multiple transfers totaling $15,000. All executed between 5:45 and 6:15 this morning while the account holder was presumably asleep. I pressed 1 to confirm that yes, these transactions were fraudulent. Yes, I wanted to freeze the account immediately. Yes, I understood that law enforcement would be contacted. What the voice didn't know, what David sleeping in our bed didn't know, was that those transfers had moved exactly nothing. The account had been emptied weeks ago, every penny of my inheritance from my grandmother's estate safely relocated to an institution 3 states away, along with documentation that would make this morning's betrayal look like child's play compared to what I discovered about the man I'd once promised to love until death do us part. The thing about trust is that it doesn't shatter all at once. It cracks. Tiny fractures that spread slowly until one day you realize the entire foundation has been compromised and you're standing on ground that was never as solid as you believed. For me, the first crack appeared on a Tuesday in March. David had been working late again, the 3rd time that week, and I'd grabbed his laptop to order groceries while mine was updating. The browser auto-filled a website I didn't recognize. Just muscle memory, the kind of digital breadcrumb that reveals where we spend our time when we think no one is watching. The site was for Pacific Credit Solutions, a debt consolidation company I'd never heard of. We didn't have debt that needed consolidating. We didn't have debt at all, unless you counted the mortgage, and even I was ahead of schedule thanks to the inheritance that had come through 6 months earlier when Grandma Pearl passed. $50,000 that was supposed to be our future. The down payment on the lake house we'd talked about for years. The security that would let David finally leave his soul-crushing corporate job and pursue the photography business he'd dreamed about since college. Money that, according to Pacific Credit Solutions, was being used to settle debts I didn't know existed. The second crack came when I started paying attention to our credit card statements. Small charges at first, easily overlooked. Gas station purchases when David claimed to be working from home. Restaurants I'd never heard of during lunch hours when he said he was eating at his desk. Hotel charges on days when he was supposedly visiting his mother 2 hours away. But it was the third crack that split my world wide open. The one that came disguised as a pocket dial from David's phone on a Thursday afternoon in April. I almost hung up when I heard his voice, thinking he'd called by accident. But something in his tone made me stay on the line. He was talking to someone, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in months. Light and easy and completely unlike the tired, stressed man who'd been coming home to me every night. The woman's voice was younger than mine, softer around the edges in a way that comes from not having weathered 15 years of real life yet. She called him baby, called him her honey, made plans for the weekend that included activities and locations I was definitely not invited to. But it was what she said about money that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Thank goodness for his wife's grandmother dying when she did. Now they could finally be together properly. Start fresh. Build the life they deserved without having to scrape by on his salary alone. The life they deserved. Using money from the woman who'd raised me when my own parents died. Money that was meant to honor her memory and secure our future. Money that was apparently funding my replacement's vision of happily ever after. I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot for 2 hours after that call ended, staring at nothing, trying to reconcile the man I'd been living with for 15 years with a stranger who was systematically dismantling our marriage while planning to finance his exit with my inheritance. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting David, instead of screaming or crying or demanding explanations, I chose to become someone I'd never been before. I chose to become strategic. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It started with small changes that David was too distracted to notice. I began working late at my own job, using the extra hours to research and plan and document everything I was discovering about the financial arrangement I'd apparently never understood. Pacific Credit Solutions wasn't consolidating our debt. They were managing David's debt. Credit cards I'd never seen, personal loans I'd never agreed to, line items that painted a picture of a man living two completely different lives with completely different expense accounts. The hotel charges weren't just about afternoons with his girlfriend. They were about maintaining an entire separate existence. Weekend getaways became week-long trips. Business dinners became romantic vacations. Every lie built on top of the previous lie until the structure was so elaborate I was almost impressed by its complexity. Almost. But admiration doesn't pay the bills or recover stolen money or erase the particular kind of betrayal that comes from discovering your spouse has been treating your marriage like a business arrangement designed to fund their actual priorities. So, I started building my own structure. One designed not to deceive, but to protect. Moving the money took 3 weeks of careful planning. I couldn't just transfer everything at once without raising questions, and I needed to maintain the appearance of normalcy while gathering evidence of what David was planning. The bank statements, the loan documents, the credit applications that bore my forged signature, the correspondence with Pacific Credit Solutions that outlined a timeline for David's financial independence that coincided suspiciously with what I now recognized were conversations about divorce. Not conversations with me, of course. Conversations with his girlfriend about the legal technicalities of ending a marriage while preserving as much of the marital assets as possible. Assets that included my inheritance, which David had somehow convinced himself he was entitled to despite having no legal claim to money that had been left specifically to me. The attorney I consulted was a woman named Patricia Wells who specialized in financial fraud cases. She listened to my story without judgment, reviewed my documentation with a kind of careful attention that made me understand why she charged $300 an hour, and delivered her assessment with the bluntness I needed to hear. David wasn't just cheating. He was setting up a comprehensive financial betrayal designed to leave me with nothing while he started fresh with someone else using resources that were legally and morally mine. The forged signatures alone were enough for criminal charges. The unauthorized access to accounts, the fraudulent loan applications, the systematic deception about our financial status while planning his exit strategy added up to what Patricia called a textbook case of financial abuse. But building a legal case takes time, and David was getting more careless by the day. More rushed. Whatever timeline he'd established with his girlfriend was apparently accelerating, and I could feel him becoming more desperate to access money that was no longer where he thought it was. The first attempt came in late May. A transfer request that required my signature, presented over dinner with a kind of casual confidence that suggested he'd been planning this conversation for weeks. Something about consolidating our accounts for better interest rates. Simplifying our finances now that we had this windfall from my grandmother. Making it easier to manage our investments as we looked toward the future. I signed the papers while asking questions about interest rates and investment strategies, playing the role of the trusting wife while documenting every detail for Patricia's files. The signature I provided was legitimate, but the account it authorized access to contained exactly $47. The real money was already safe, scattered across 3 different institutions under my name only, protected by passwords and security protocols that didn't include David's fingerprints or social security number, or any of the other access methods he'd grown accustomed to using during our marriage. His confusion when the transfer failed was almost amusing. Almost. Because buried underneath the frustration and disbelief was something that looked like panic, and panic makes people dangerous. That's when I realized David wasn't just planning to leave me broke. He was planning to leave me soon. Very soon. The second attempt was more direct. Less elegant. a request to add him as an authorized user on the account where my inheritance was supposedly being held. For tax purposes, he explained. Estate planning considerations that his financial advisor had recommended. I'd never heard of this financial advisor. When I asked for details, David gave me a name and phone number that traced back to a prepaid cell phone registered to an address that didn't exist. That night, while David slept beside me, I moved the last of our joint savings to accounts he couldn't access. Not just my inheritance money, but everything we'd built together over 15 years of shared paychecks and mutual sacrifices, and all the small financial decisions that constitute the infrastructure of a marriage. I wasn't stealing from him. I was protecting what was mine before he could steal it from me. But I left enough in the original accounts to make his final attempt possible. Enough to give him enough rope to hang himself with, as my grandmother used to say. Enough to create the kind of documented fraud that would make Patricia's job significantly easier when the time came. The fingerprint attempt was almost inevitable. David had used mine before for minor things, phone unlocks and app purchases, always with permission and always for shared conveniences. The joint accounts were set up to accept either of our biometric signatures, a security feature that had seemed practical when we established it. He'd been staring at his phone more often lately, calculating something I wasn't meant to understand, making calls that ended when I walked into the room, receiving texts that made him smile in ways that had nothing to do with me. The girlfriend was pushing him harder now. I could tell from the tension he carried in his shoulders, the way he snapped at me over nothing, the increasing frequency of his late nights and weekend absences. Whatever schedule they'd established was no longer theoretical. It was happening. I started sleeping in the guest room, claiming his snoring was keeping me awake. What I was actually doing was positioning myself where I could hear him moving around at night, where I could monitor his activity without appearing suspicious. For 3 nights, nothing happened. David went to bed at his normal time, stayed there until morning, maintained the routine we'd established over 15 years of sharing the same space. But on the 4th night, I heard him get up at 5:30. Not the bathroom visit or glass of water trips that punctuated most people's sleep cycles. This was purposeful movement, quiet but determined. I lay still in the guest bed, listening to the soft sound of his bare feet on the hardwood floor, the careful way he opened and closed our bedroom door, the barely audible tap of fingers on his phone screen. He was in the kitchen for 27 minutes. I counted every one of them, my own phone silent beside me, the bank alerts disabled for my active accounts, but still enabled for the decoy accounts I'd left accessible. The same accounts that contained just enough money to constitute felony theft when he finally made his move. When he came back to bed, I heard the soft exhale of someone who thought he'd accomplished something significant. The kind of satisfied breath that comes after completing a difficult task successfully. I waited until his breathing returned to the deep, steady rhythm of sleep before I allowed myself to smile in the darkness. Because David had just committed multiple felonies while I had 18 discrete recordings of his unauthorized access attempts, complete with timestamps and geolocation data that placed him in our kitchen during the exact moments when my fingerprint was being used to authorize transfers I'd never approved. The recordings were Patricia's suggestion. Proof that David was acting without my knowledge or consent. Documentation that would eliminate any possibility of him claiming the transactions were authorized or accidental. But more than evidence, they were validation. Confirmation that every suspicion, every protective measure, every careful step I'd taken over the past 3 months had been necessary and justified. The bank's fraud alert system wasn't calling to inform me that I'd been robbed. It was calling to confirm that I'd successfully caught my husband in the act of trying to rob me. Now, sitting in my kitchen with the morning sun streaming through windows David would probably never see again after today, I listened to the automated voice walk through the steps that would officially end one chapter of my life and begin another. Account frozen. Law enforcement contacted. Fraud report filed. Investigation opened. The phone calls I made next weren't automated. The first was to Patricia Wells, who answered on the second ring despite the early hour. I gave her the confirmation numbers and case reference information she'd need to coordinate with the bank's security department, then listened as she outlined the timeline for David's arrest and the civil proceedings that would follow. The second call was to my sister in Portland, who'd been waiting for this conversation since I'd first confided in her about David's suspicious behavior. She had a guest room ready for me, job contacts in my field, and the kind of unconditional support that comes from someone who'd watched me prioritize my marriage over my own well-being for too many years. The third call was to my employer, requesting immediate use of the accumulated vacation time I'd been saving for the lake house that would never happen now. Time to relocate, restart, and rebuild something that belonged entirely to me. By 7:15, I'd set in motion the machinery that would dismantle David's plans while protecting everything I'd worked to save. By 7:30, I'd loaded my car with 3 suitcases of clothes and personal items, my laptop, my grandmother's jewelry, and the folder of documents that represented 3 months of the most intensive investigative work of my life. By 7:45, I was driving away from the house David and I had shared for a decade, leaving behind a man who was still sleeping peacefully in our bed, unaware that his attempt to steal $15,000 had actually cost him his wife, his freedom, and any claim to the life we'd built together. The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, David had been planning his exit from our marriage, carefully orchestrating a financial arrangement that would leave me devastated while funding his fresh start with someone else. Instead, his betrayal had forced me to become someone stronger, smarter, and more strategic than I'd ever imagined I could be. Someone capable of outmaneuvering the person who thought he knew me well enough to destroy me. The woman driving away from that house wasn't the trusting wife who'd been blindsided by a pocket-dialed phone call 3 months earlier. She was someone who'd learned to protect herself, to document everything, to think several steps ahead of the person trying to hurt her. Someone who discovered that the best revenge isn't emotional satisfaction. It's legal justice served with the kind of precision that comes from careful planning and meticulous execution. The phone rang again as I merged onto the interstate. Not the bank this time, but Patricia's office, confirming that the arrest warrant had been issued and that David would likely be in custody before lunch. I should have felt vindicated. Triumphant. Satisfied that months of careful planning had resulted in exactly the outcome I'd worked toward. Instead, I felt something more complex. Relief mixed with sadness. Anger tempered by exhaustion. The hollow satisfaction that comes from winning a game you never wanted to play in the first place. Because protecting yourself from someone you love requires you to become someone you never thought you'd need to be. It requires you to learn skills you hoped you'd never use, to develop instincts you wish you didn't need, to make decisions that change you in ways that outlast the crisis that created them. 3 months ago, I was a woman who trusted her husband completely and never questioned the financial decisions we made together. I was someone who believed that marriage meant shared everything, including the money that came from my grandmother's lifetime of savings and sacrifice. Now I was someone who could forge signatures and manipulate bank accounts and create elaborate deceptions with the efficiency of a professional con artist. Someone who could sleep peacefully in a guest bedroom while recording her husband's attempts to rob her blind. The transformation had been necessary, but it wasn't free. Still, as I drove toward Portland and whatever version of my life was waiting there, I found myself thinking about the conversation David would have with his girlfriend later today. How he'd explained that the $15,000 he'd promised her was actually $0, and that the fresh start he'd been planning was now a criminal defense case that would consume whatever resources he had left. How he'd tell her that the trusting, naive wife he'd been planning to abandon had actually been 3 steps ahead of him for months, systematically protecting herself while he thought he was systematically destroying her. The phone calls would start soon. David trying to reach me after he discovered the empty accounts and the arrest warrant, and the civil suit that would claim everything he thought he was entitled to. His girlfriend realizing that the wealthy older man she'd been dating was actually a broke criminal whose grand romantic gesture had been attempting to steal money from his wife. Patricia predicting that David would try to negotiate, to minimize his legal exposure by claiming the whole thing was a misunderstanding between spouses who'd simply had different interpretations of shared financial access. The bank security department explaining that unauthorized use of someone else's biometric signature constituted identity theft regardless of the relationship between the parties involved. The district attorney's office outlining the sentencing guidelines for financial fraud in cases involving amounts over $10,000. But those conversations would happen without me. I'd already said everything I needed to say through the careful accumulation of evidence and the strategic protection of resources and the kind of methodical documentation that speaks louder than any emotional confrontation ever could. By the time David woke up this morning, I'd already been gone for an hour. By the time he discovered what I'd done, I'd be halfway to a new state and a new life funded entirely by money he'd never been entitled to in the first place. By the time he understood that his careful plan to rob me had actually been the catalyst for me to save myself, it would be too late for him to do anything but face the consequences of choices he'd made while assuming I was too trusting to protect myself. The sun was fully up now, burning off the early morning fog and revealing the landscape I was driving toward. Mountains in the distance, green fields on both sides of the highway, clear sky that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. Behind me, in a house I'd never returned to, my husband was probably just beginning to stir, reaching across the bed for a wife who'd already filed the papers that would end our marriage while ensuring he faced the full legal consequences of his betrayal. Ahead of me, in a city I'd visited but never lived in, my sister was preparing a guest room for someone she'd watched transform from victim to survivor to something harder and more resilient than either of us had imagined possible. The woman arriving in Portland wouldn't be the same person who'd left that morning. She'd be someone who'd learned that the people we trust most are sometimes the ones most capable of destroying us, and that surviving that destruction requires us to become people we never thought we'd need to be. Someone who discovered that the best protection isn't emotional armor or cynical suspicion, but careful attention to details and the willingness to act on uncomfortable truths before they become devastating losses. Someone who'd learned that love isn't enough to sustain a marriage when one person is systematically betraying the trust that makes love possible in the first place. The phone rang one more time as I crossed the state line. David's number, probably calling from the police station where he was processing the reality that his attempt to steal from me had resulted in his arrest for multiple felonies. I let it go to voicemail. Whatever he had to say now, after months of lies and deception and careful planning to destroy me financially while presenting himself as a loving husband, wasn't something I needed to hear. Because I'd already heard everything I needed to know. In pocket-dialed conversations and forged signatures and late-night transfers made with my fingerprints while I slept. I'd heard it, documented it, and responded to it with the kind of strategic thinking that had turned David's plan to rob me into evidence that would be used to prosecute him. The woman who'd answered that first fraud alert call was someone David thought he knew well enough to deceive and manipulate and ultimately discard. The woman driving toward her new life was someone else entirely. Someone he'd never met, never anticipated, and never prepared for. Someone who discovered that the best response to betrayal isn't revenge or forgiveness, but the careful protection of yourself and everything you value while ensuring that the person who tried to destroy you faces the full consequences of their choices. David had wanted to steal $15,000 from me while I slept. Instead, he'd lost his wife, his freedom, and his future, while I remained 3 steps ahead of him at every turn. That wasn't revenge. That was justice. And sometimes, when you're protecting yourself from someone who's supposed to love you, justice is the only form of love you have left to give yourself. The road stretched ahead, empty and full of possibilities that belonged entirely to me now. Behind me, the life I'd shared with David was already fading into something that felt like it had happened to someone else. Someone I used to be before I learned how to save myself.